The scream came before the music stopped. Elara Sinclair froze at the edge of the grand hall, her fingers tightening around the folded paper in her hand. Somewhere ahead of her, past the rows of silk gowns and polished shoes, a woman had cried out. Not a scream of joy, a scream of shock. She should not have been there at all. 3 days earlier, she had been scrubbing the kitchen floor of the Whitmore house when Agnes, the young housemaid, pressed a small envelope into her palm and whispered that it had come for a cousin who could not travel. Agnes said the seat would go empty otherwise, and that no one would notice one more face in a hall full of 500 guests. Elara had almost said no. She always said no. Saying yes to anything in that house usually ended badly. But this was Verity's wedding, her stepsister. The girl who had taken her father's love, then her father's money, then her father's house, and left Elara with nothing but a small room above the stables and a life spent washing other people's linen. Elara wanted just once to stand in a room and watch Verity get everything she had always wanted, and know, quietly in her own chest, that she had come anyway, that she had not been erased completely. So she had gone. She had nothing fit to wear. Her only good dress had belonged to her mother, packed away in a trunk for 12 years, its fabric soft with age and slightly torn at the hem where moths had found it long before Elara ever did. She had spent 2 nights by candlelight repairing it as best she could, stitching the tears closed, brushing the dust from the fabric, praying it would be enough to get her through the door. It was not enough. She knew that the moment she stepped into the hall and felt every eye turned toward her. The dress was old. Its color had faded from a deep blue to something closer to gray. The lace at the collar was yellowed. Compared to the guests around her, dressed in silk and pearls, she looked like a servant who had wandered in by mistake, which was, in a way, exactly what everyone in that room assumed she was. She kept her chin up anyway. Her mother had taught her that much before she died. Chin up, shoulders back, and never let them see you shrink. Around her neck, hidden mostly beneath the collar of her dress, hung a small gold locket. It was the one thing she owned that had never been taken from her, because no one in the Whitmore house had ever cared enough to notice it. It was old, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, engraved with a small crest she had never been able to make sense of. Her mother had given it to her when she was 6 years old, the year before she died, and told her to never take it off, no matter what happened. Elara had kept that promise every single day since. She moved along the back wall of the hall, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear into the crowd, the way she had learned to disappear in every room of the Whitmore house for the last 10 years. The wedding had not yet begun. Guests were still arriving, laughing, embracing, exchanging news of who had married whom and whose fortune had grown and whose had shrunk. Elara recognized almost no one. She had never been permitted to attend events like this. She had only ever heard about them from the kitchen, second-hand, through the mouths of servants who came home from delivering flowers or altering gowns. Then she saw her stepmother. Constance Whitmore stood near the front of the hall in a gown of deep burgundy, her hair pinned with jewels that had once belonged to Elara's own mother, taken from a trunk Elara had been told was empty. Constance was laughing at something a guest had said, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a man Elara did not recognize. She looked exactly as she always did in public. Warm. Gracious, beloved. Elara had learned a long time ago that the version of Constance the world saw was not the version that lived in that house. She was so focused on watching her stepmother that she nearly missed the moment everything changed. A man had entered from a side door near the front of the hall, dressed in dark formal clothing that marked him instantly as someone of high standing, someone whose presence made the room shift slightly, the way a pond shifts when a stone breaks its surface. He was tall, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, and he moved through the crowd the way people move who have never once in their lives had to ask permission to be somewhere. Elara did not know who he was. She only knew, from the way 3 separate groups of guests turned to greet him, that he was someone important, someone the Whitmores would have been thrilled to have in attendance. She watched him accept a glass of wine from a passing servant, watched him nod politely at whoever spoke to him, watched him scan the room the way people do when they are waiting for someone specific to arrive. And then his eyes landed on her. At first she thought nothing of it. People often looked at her strangely in rooms like this, confused about why someone dressed so plainly was standing among guests dressed so finely. She expected him to look away, the way everyone else had. Instead, his gaze stayed fixed on her, and something in his expression shifted from mild curiosity to something sharper. Something that looked, strangely, like disbelief. She glanced down at herself, wondering if her dress had torn further, if some new flaw had appeared to draw attention to her. She found nothing. She looked back up and he was still watching her, and now he had gone very still, the wine glass forgotten in his hand. A woman beside him said something, touching his arm, and he did not respond. He was still looking at Alara, or rather she realized with a small chill he was looking at her neck. Her hand rose instinctively to the locket at her throat, the way it always did when she felt uneasy, and the moment her fingers touched the gold, something changed in the man's face entirely. His jaw tightened. He set the wine glass down on the nearest table without looking at it, and he began walking toward her. Alara's heart began to pound. She had no idea what she had done wrong. She had come to this wedding uninvited, dressed in rags compared to everyone around her, and now a man who looked like he owned half the county was walking straight toward her with an expression she could not read at all. Her first instinct was to run, to slip out the side door before he reached her, before whatever was about to happen actually happened. But her feet would not move. Something about the way he was looking at her, not with scorn, not with the disgust she expected from someone of his standing, but with a kind of stunned recognition, kept her rooted in place. He stopped a few feet away from her. Up close she could see he was older than she first thought, perhaps in his 40s, with lines around his eyes that suggested both years of authority and years of worry. His clothes were finer than anything she had ever seen, dark fabric with silver detailing at the cuffs, and yet none of that seemed to matter to him in this moment. His attention was entirely on the small gold shape resting against her collarbone. "Where," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the noise of the hall, "did you get that locket?" Alara's hand tightened around it protectively. Years of living in a house where everything she owned could be taken from her at any moment had trained her to guard the few things that were truly hers. "It was my mother's," she said, and she was proud that her voice did not shake, even though her hands were trembling at her sides. "She gave it to me before she died. I've worn it every day since." The man's eyes did not leave the locket. "May I see it more closely?" It was such a strange request, coming from a stranger in the middle of a wedding, that for a moment Alara simply stared at him. Around them, a few guests had begun to notice the exchange, their conversations quieting, their attention drifting toward the two of them the way attention always drifts toward anything unusual in a room full of people trying not to look bored. "Why does it matter to you?" Alara asked. She did not mean to sound defensive, but a decade of being treated as less than nothing had left its mark on how she spoke to people she did not know. The man did not answer right away. Instead, he glanced around the hall as though suddenly aware of how many people were watching, and something in his posture shifted, straightened, the way a man's posture shifts when he remembers he is standing in public and must behave accordingly. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter still. "Because I have seen that mark only once before in my life," he said, "on a locket that belonged to a family everyone believed had no daughters left." Alara did not understand what he meant. She opened her mouth to ask him to explain, but before she could speak, a familiar voice cut across the space between them, sharp and furious and entirely too loud for the setting. "Alara!" She turned to find Constance Whitmore striding toward her, her burgundy gown sweeping the floor, her face arranged into a smile so tight it looked painful, though her eyes carried none of the warmth of the expression. Beside her, having clearly abandoned some conversation across the hall, was Verity, dressed in a gown so elaborate it seemed to take up half the aisle by itself, her face flushed with the particular fury of a bride who has just discovered an uninvited guest at her own wedding. "I did not realize we had invited the help," Constance said sweetly, though the words were sharp enough to cut. She reached Alara's side and placed a hand on her arm, not gently, her fingers digging in just enough to communicate exactly what she intended. "You must have wandered in by mistake, dear. Let me help you find your way out." Alara felt her face go hot with humiliation, felt every eye in the hall now turning toward her, felt the familiar weight of being smaller and less important than everyone around her settle over her shoulders like a coat she had never asked to wear. She had known this moment might come. She had told herself she would not care. She found, standing there, that she cared very much. But the man who had asked about the locket did not step back. If anything, he stepped slightly forward, positioning himself in a way that made it clear he had no intention of allowing Constance to simply remove Alara from the room. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, his tone perfectly polite, and yet carrying an authority that made Constance's hand still on Alara's arm. "But I believe I know this young woman's family. Or rather, I believe I recognize something she is wearing. I would very much like a moment to speak with her, if you don't mind." Constance's smile did not waver, but something behind her eyes flickered, a brief, uncertain calculation, the look of someone recalculating a plan on the fly. "I'm afraid you must be mistaken," she said smoothly. "Alara has no family beyond our household. Her mother passed many years ago, and she has been under my care ever since." "Her mother," the man repeated slowly, and his gaze moved from Constance back to Alara, back to the locket at her throat. "And what was her mother's name?" The question hung in the air. Alara realized with a small jolt that she had spoken her mother's name aloud perhaps a handful of times in the last decade. Constance had never permitted it. Any mention of her mother in that house had always been met with a sharp reminder that the past was the past and dwelling on it served no purpose. "Rosalind," Alara said quietly before Constance could answer for her. "Her name was Rosalind." The color drained from the man's face. For a long moment he said nothing at all. The music in the hall continued somewhere in the background, oblivious to the small, tense scene unfolding near the edge of the room, but everyone standing close enough to hear had gone silent, watching the strange stillness that had come over him. "Rosalind," he repeated, as though testing the shape of the word in his mouth. "Rosalind Sinclair." It was not a question. Alara felt something cold move through her chest because she had not told him her mother's surname. She had not told him anything beyond a single first name, and yet he had spoken it as though he had known it his entire life, as though the name had been waiting somewhere inside him for years, ready to be spoken the moment the right person appeared. "How do you know that name?" Alara whispered. The man reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew something small, holding it out on his open palm for her to see. It was a locket, nearly identical to her own, gold, worn smooth with age, engraved with the very same crest that hung at her own throat. "Because," he said quietly, "I have been looking for the owner of this one's twin for 22 years. Somewhere behind them, Constance Whitmore made a small, strangled sound, and Alara turned just in time to see the color drain entirely from her stepmother's face, replaced by something that looked unmistakably like fear. Constance Whitmore did not answer right away. She stood frozen beside her daughter, her hand still resting on Alara's arm, though her grip had gone slack, as though the strength had simply drained out of her fingers. The color that had left her face had not returned. She looked, for the first time in all the years Alara had known her, genuinely afraid. Verity broke the silence first. "What is happening?" she demanded, looking between her mother and the stranger holding the small gold locket. "Mother, who is this man, and why is he speaking to the maid?" The word maid landed hard, but the man did not so much as glance at Verity. His attention remained entirely on Alara, on the locket at her throat, on the resemblance he seemed to be searching for in her face. "My name is Alistair Grayson," he said, addressing Alara directly, his voice gentler now than it had been a moment before, as though he sensed how overwhelming this all must be for her. "I hold the title of Duke of Ashcombe. 22 years ago, a woman named Rosalind Sinclair disappeared from my family's records entirely, along with every trace of her existence. I was a young man then, barely more than a boy myself, but I remember the search that followed. I remember my own father spending a fortune trying to find her, and failing." Alara felt the ground shift beneath her, though she had not physically moved at all. "I don't understand," she said. "My mother was not part of any noble family. She raised me in a small cottage outside the village. She sewed dresses to earn our living. She never once spoke of dukes or titles or searches." "That does not surprise me," Alistair said quietly. "If she hid herself as thoroughly as it seems she did, she would not have wanted you to know the truth. Knowing it may have put you both in danger." Constance finally found her voice, though it came out thinner than her usual practiced warmth. "This is absurd," she said. "You are speaking to a servant girl at my daughter's wedding based on nothing more than a trinket. Lockets like that are sold in shops throughout the county. It means nothing." "It is not sold in any shop," Alistair said, and for the first time since he had approached, there was an edge in his voice, cold and precise. "This crest belongs to the Sinclair family of Ashcombe, a family my own house has been connected to for 4 generations through marriage and alliance. There are only ever 2 of these lockets made for each generation of daughters born into that line, crafted by the same jeweler my family has used for 100 years. I know this because I hold its twin, which was given to me by my own mother, who was Rosalind Sinclair's cousin." The hall had gone almost entirely silent now. Word of the confrontation had spread through the crowd the way word always spreads at gatherings like this, guest to guest, whisper to whisper, until nearly every eye in the room had turned toward the small cluster of people standing near the back wall. Alara felt the weight of all that attention pressing down on her, and for a moment she wanted nothing more than to disappear entirely, to slip out the door and never think about any of this again. But another part of her, a part she had not allowed herself to listen to in years, wanted desperately to know the truth. "If what you're saying is true," Alara said slowly, "then why would my mother have hidden it from me? Why would she have lived in poverty, sewing dresses to survive, if she came from a family with wealth and titles?" Alistair's expression softened with something that looked almost like sorrow. "That," he said, "is a question I have wondered about for 2 decades. I have my suspicions, but I would rather not speak them here, in front of so many people, until I know more." Constance's composure had cracked entirely now. She was staring at the locket around Alara's neck as though it were a snake coiled at her throat, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost all of its practiced sweetness. "This conversation does not belong at my daughter's wedding," she said sharply. "Whatever fantasy this girl has constructed, or whatever mistaken assumptions this gentleman has made, they can be sorted out another time. Today is Verity's day, and I will not have it ruined by servants and strangers making a spectacle." "I am not making a spectacle," Alistair said calmly. "I am simply asking questions that deserve answers. If you have nothing to hide, Lady Whitmore, then you should have no objection to answering them." Something flickered across Constance's face, quick and involuntary, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but Alara caught it, and so, she suspected, did the Duke. It was the look of someone who had just realized the walls of a carefully built structure had begun to crack. "I object," Constance said, "because this is neither the time nor the place. Alara, come with me, we will discuss this privately." "No," Alara said. The word surprised even her, coming out sharper and steadier than she expected. She had spent 10 years obeying every instruction Constance gave her, biting back every objection, swallowing every unfairness because she had nowhere else to go and no one else to turn to. But something about standing in this hall, in her mother's old dress, with a stranger holding a locket that matched her own and speaking her mother's full name as though he had known her personally, gave her a courage she had not felt in years. "I would like to know the truth," Alara continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. If my mother had a family, if she had a life before the one I knew, I deserve to know why she left it. I deserve to know why she never told me. Constance's jaw tightened. You are embarrassing yourself, she hissed, low enough that only Alara and Alistair could hear. Whatever this man thinks he knows, it changes nothing about who you are. You are a servant in my household, and you will remember your place. She is not a servant, Alistair said, his voice carrying easily across the small distance between them, loud enough now that several nearby guests turned fully to watch. If what I suspect is true, she is the last living heir of a noble house that has stood empty for over 2 decades, and I intend to find out exactly how she came to be standing in your kitchen wearing rags while wearing a locket worth more than this entire wedding. A ripple of gasps moved through the nearby guests. Verity's face had gone pale, her earlier fury replaced by something closer to panic as she glanced between her mother and the Duke, clearly trying to understand how her wedding day had transformed so quickly into something entirely beyond her control. Mother, Verity said quietly, what is he talking about? Constance did not answer. She was staring at Alara now with an expression Alara had never seen on her stepmother's face before, something that mixed fury with what looked, unmistakably, like fear of being found out. It was in that silence, that long, uncomfortable silence, that a new voice entered the conversation. Forgive the interruption, said an older woman who had pushed her way through the crowd, leaning on a cane, her gray hair pulled back beneath a simple bonnet that marked her as staff rather than guest. Alara recognized her immediately. Agnes Doyle's grandmother, Martha, had worked in the Whitmore household for decades before her age forced her into retirement, and she had known Alara's mother personally, back before Rosalind had died. I could not help but overhear, Martha said, her voice trembling slightly with age but carrying a strength that cut through the tension in the hall. And I believe I have information that may be useful to this conversation. Constance's eyes widened in alarm. Martha, this is not the place. I have kept quiet for 12 years, Martha interrupted, and there was something fierce in her tone despite her frailty. I have watched that child grow up in your kitchen, scrubbing floors that should have been scrubbed by someone else, wearing dresses handed down from your own daughter until they fell apart, and I have said nothing because I was afraid of losing my position and my pension. But I will not stay silent any longer, not when the truth is standing right here in front of everyone. Alistair turned toward her immediately, his full attention now on the old woman. You knew Rosalind Sinclair. I worked for her family before I ever worked for the Whitmores, Martha said. I was a young girl myself when Lady Rosalind was born into the Sinclair house. I watched her grow up in more comfort than any of us in this room have ever known, and I watched her disappear entirely one autumn, along with every trace that she had ever existed, after a terrible falling out with her own father. Alara felt her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What kind of falling out? Martha's eyes, pale and clouded with age, settled on Alara with something like tenderness. Your mother fell in love with a man her father considered unworthy of her, she said. A tradesman, kind and hardworking but without title or fortune. Her father forbade the match, threatened to disown her if she pursued it. She chose him anyway. She left everything behind, every comfort, every privilege, every piece of the life she had known, to be with the man she loved. Her father, in his fury, erased her from every record he could reach, told the world she had died of fever rather than admit his own daughter had chosen love over legacy. The hall had gone completely silent now, every guest straining to hear the old woman's words. Alara felt tears gathering in her eyes, tears she had not expected and could not quite explain, grief for a mother she thought she had already fully mourned, grief now mixed with something entirely new, a strange, aching pride. She never once complained, Alara whispered. She never told me any of this. She simply loved my father, and after he died she raised me alone, and she never spoke of regret. She would not have, Martha said gently. She was proud, your mother, prouder than anyone gave her credit for. She would rather have lived in poverty than admit her father had been right to doubt her choice. Alistair had been listening to all of this with an intensity that seemed to grow with every word, and now he stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between himself and Alara entirely. "If this is true," he said, "then you are not merely connected to the Sinclair family by blood. You are its last surviving heir. Your grandfather, Lord Edmund Sinclair, passed away 6 years ago without ever reconciling with your mother. His estate, his titles, his lands, everything that once belonged to the Sinclair name has sat in legal limbo ever since, tied up in courts because no living heir could be found to claim it." Alara felt the room tilt slightly around her. "That's not possible," she said. "I have lived my entire life believing I had nothing. No family, no name beyond the one given to me by circumstance, nothing to my name but the clothes I am wearing and the locket around my neck." "And yet," Alistair said quietly, "here you stand." Constance, who had remained silent through Martha's entire account, seemed to find her voice again, though it came out strained and desperate now, all pretense of grace abandoned. "Even if any of this were true," she said, "it changes nothing about her circumstances today. She has no proof beyond an old woman's memory and a trinket that could belong to anyone." "I have proof," Martha said simply. "Letters, written by Rosalind herself in the months before she left her father's house, addressed to me, describing exactly what had happened and why she was leaving. I have kept them all these years hidden away because I did not know what else to do with them, and because some part of me always hoped this day would come." Alara turned to stare at the old woman, stunned beyond words. "You have letters from my mother?" "In my cottage," Martha said, nodding, "every one of them. I read them so many times over the years I could recite them from memory, though I have kept them safe and untouched, waiting for someone who might need them." Alistair looked from Martha to Alara, and something in his expression had shifted entirely from the cautious curiosity he had shown at the start of the conversation to something firmer, more determined. "Then I believe," he said, "we have a great deal to discuss, and very little time to waste discussing it standing in the middle of a wedding hall." Constance made one final attempt to regain control of the situation, stepping forward with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her voice pitched to carry the particular tone of authority she used when addressing servants who had stepped out of line. "Alara," she said, "you will come with me now. This conversation is over." But Alara did not move. For the first time in 10 years, standing in a wedding hall in a torn blue dress while half the guests in attendance watched with open fascination, she found that Constance Whitmore's voice no longer held the power over her that it once had. "No," she said again, and this time her voice did not waver at all. "I don't believe it is." The groom, Edmund Ashford, had been standing near the front of the hall throughout the entire exchange, watching with an expression of growing confusion as his wedding day dissolved into something he had never anticipated. He was a tall young man with an honest face, the kind of face that had not yet learned to hide its feelings, and as he made his way toward the small crowd gathered near the back wall, it was clear from his expression that he was beginning to understand just how much had been kept from him. "Verity," he said quietly, reaching his bride's side, "is any of this true? Did you know about this?" Verity's face had gone from pale to a blotchy red, humiliation and confusion warring across her features. "I knew nothing," she said, though her voice cracked slightly on the words, and Alara, who had spent a decade learning to read every shift in her stepsister's expression, could tell she was not being entirely honest. Alistair did not wait for the family drama to resolve itself. He turned to a man standing near the entrance of the hall, someone Alara had not noticed before, dressed in a plain dark coat that marked him as staff rather than guest. "Bring my carriage around," he said, "and send word to my solicitor that I require his presence at the earliest possible hour tomorrow morning." The man nodded and disappeared through the side door without a word. "You cannot simply take her," Constance said, though the fight had gone out of her voice, replaced by something closer to desperation. "She is a member of my household. I have cared for her since her mother's death." "Cared for her," Martha repeated, and there was an edge of contempt in the old woman's voice that Alara had never heard from her before. "Is that what you call it? I have watched this child scrub your floors and mend your daughter's dresses and eat whatever scraps were left after your family had taken their fill, for 10 years, while wearing a locket that marks her as the heir to a fortune you must have known about the entire time." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable, and Alara felt something cold settle in her chest as she turned to look at her stepmother more closely. "You knew," she said slowly, the realization dawning on her even as she spoke the words aloud. "You knew who my mother was. You knew what that locket meant." Constance's silence was answer enough. "I did not know everything," Constance finally admitted, her voice tight and controlled even now, even as the truth began to slip free of the careful walls she had built around it for years. "Your mother told me a little before she died, enough that I understood there had once been a family with money involved. I assumed it meant nothing, that whatever connection existed had been severed too completely to matter." "And yet you kept me in your household," Alara said. "You kept me close, working for nothing, dressed in rags for 10 years. If you believed the connection meant nothing, why did it matter to keep me at all? Why not simply send me away?" The question landed like a blow, and Constance's composure finally cracked entirely, her carefully maintained expression collapsing into something raw and unguarded. "Because I was not certain," she said, her voice dropping low enough that only those closest could hear. "I was not certain the connection meant nothing, and I could not risk you discovering the truth on your own and vanishing to claim whatever inheritance might exist, leaving me with nothing to show for the years I had spent raising you." "Raising me," Alara repeated, her voice shaking now with an anger she had suppressed for a decade. "You did not raise me, you used me. You kept me close enough to control, in case there was ever anything worth controlling, and you made certain I never had the resources or the knowledge to discover the truth myself." Alistair's expression had grown darker with every word of the exchange, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the particular calm of a man who has decided a matter is settled and will not be argued further. "I believe," he said, "that this conversation has revealed quite enough for one evening. Lady Whitmore, you will want to consider your next words very carefully, because everything you have said in the last several minutes has been overheard by a room full of witnesses, several of whom I recognize as members of the legal profession." A murmur moved through the crowd as several guests exchanged glances, and Alara realized with a start that the Duke was right. Among the wedding guests stood at least 2 men she now recognized, vaguely, from occasions when they had visited the Whitmore house on legal matters concerning her father's estate, matters she had never been permitted to fully understand. Constance's face had gone entirely white. "I think," Alistair continued, turning back to Alara with a gentler expression than he had shown Constance, "that you should come with me tonight, along with Mrs. Doyle, so that we might review these letters properly and begin to understand exactly what has happened here. I will arrange for you to stay somewhere comfortable and secure while my solicitor investigates the matter of your inheritance formally. No one will force you to return to a household where you have clearly not been treated as you deserved." Alara looked around the hall, at the hundreds of faces still watching, at Verity standing pale and stricken beside her new husband, at Constance, frozen in place with the particular stillness of someone watching their entire carefully constructed world begin to collapse, and she felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something like hope. "I would like that," she said quietly. "Thank you." The journey to Martha's cottage took less than an hour, though it felt to Alara like traveling into an entirely different life. Alistair's carriage was more comfortable than anything she had ever ridden in, its interior lined with soft cushions and warmed by a small heater tucked beneath the seats, and she sat in stunned silence for most of the ride, staring out the window at the passing countryside, trying to absorb everything that had happened in the span of a single evening. Martha sat across from her, her cane resting against her knee, watching Alara with an expression of quiet sympathy. "It is a great deal to take in all at once," the old woman said gently. I remember how overwhelmed your mother looked the day she finally told me the truth about her family. You have that same look about you now." "I don't know what to believe," Alara admitted. "An hour ago I was a servant with nothing. Now a duke is telling me I might be the heir to a fortune I never knew existed. It feels like a dream I will wake up from at any moment." "It is not a dream," Alistair said from his seat beside Martha, his voice steady and reassuring. "Though I understand why it feels like one. I have spent 22 years wondering what became of Rosalind Sinclair. I never imagined I would find the answer at my own business associate's wedding, standing across the hall in a torn blue dress." Alara flushed slightly at the reminder of her appearance, and Alistair, seeming to notice her discomfort, added quickly, "I do not say that to embarrass you. I say it because I have thought a great deal, in the short time since this evening began, about how strange it is that the truth so often arrives wrapped in the last packaging anyone expects. If you had arrived in silk and jewels, I might never have looked twice. It was the contrast, the fact that someone wearing something so precious was dressed so plainly, that caught my attention in the first place." Martha's cottage, when they arrived, was small but warm, tucked at the edge of a quiet village Alara had passed through only a handful of times in her life. The old woman moved slowly but with purpose, lighting candles and stoking the small fire in the hearth before disappearing into a back room, and returning several minutes later with a wooden box, its surface worn smooth with age, tied shut with a length of faded ribbon. "These have sat in the bottom of my trunk for 12 years, Martha said, settling into a chair near the fire and untying the ribbon with careful, deliberate fingers. "I have read them so many times I could recite whole passages by heart, but I always kept them safe, waiting for the day someone might need them." She withdrew a bundle of letters, their paper yellowed and soft with age, and held them out toward Alara with both hands, as though offering something sacred. Alara took them with trembling fingers. The handwriting on the outermost letter was elegant and looping, entirely unfamiliar to her, and yet something about it made her chest ache in a way she could not fully explain, as though some part of her recognized it despite having never seen it before. "Would you like me to read them aloud?" Martha asked gently, "or would you prefer to read them yourself in your own time?" Alara looked down at the bundle in her hands, at the careful handwriting that belonged to a mother she thought she had known completely, and realized she had spent her entire life believing she understood the full shape of her mother's story, only to discover now that an entire hidden chapter had existed all along, waiting patiently to be found. "Please," she said quietly, "read them to me. I don't think I can do it myself, not yet." Martha nodded, settling her spectacles onto her nose, and unfolded the first letter with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious. "My dearest Martha," she began, her voice softening as she read, "I write to you tonight with a heart divided between joy and fear, for I have made a decision that will change the entire course of my life, and I do not know yet whether I have made the right choice." As Martha read on, Alara closed her eyes and listened, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt as though she were truly meeting her, not the tired, careful woman who had raised her in poverty and never once complained, but a young woman full of courage and fear and love, standing at the edge of an enormous decision, choosing, again and again, to follow her own heart rather than the path laid out for her by others. Outside, the fire crackled softly, and the night stretched on, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the cottage window, an entire life Alara had never known existed slowly began to take shape. The letters told a story unlike anything Alara had imagined. Her mother had grown up in a grand estate called Ashcombe Hall, the only surviving daughter of Lord Edmund Sinclair, a man whose wealth had been built across 3 generations of careful investment, and whose pride, according to Martha's careful reading, had grown just as large as his fortune. Rosalind had been raised to expect a life of comfort and status, educated by private tutors, trained in the manners and expectations of noble society, groomed from childhood for a marriage that would strengthen her family's position among the great houses of the region. And then, at 19 years old, she had met a young carpenter named Thaddeus Hale, hired to repair a section of fencing along the edge of her father's property, and everything she had been raised to want had suddenly seemed unbearably small compared to the life she found herself imagining instead. "He made me laugh in a way no one in this house ever has," Martha read from the second letter, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly building beneath it. "He does not care what my father's title is worth or what dowry might come attached to my hand. He asks me what I think, what I want, what makes me happy, and no one in 19 years of my life has ever once asked me those questions before." Elara sat perfectly still, absorbing every word, trying to reconcile the image forming in her mind with the quiet, tired woman she remembered from her childhood, the woman who had spent long hours bent over a sewing table, who had never once spoken of grand houses or noble titles, who had raised Elara with nothing but love and hard work, and had never, not once, let slip a hint of the life she had left behind. The later letters grew darker in tone. Lord Sinclair had discovered the relationship and forbidden it outright, threatening to disown his daughter entirely if she continued to see the carpenter. Rosalind had tried, at first, to obey, to end the relationship and return to the path her father had chosen for her, but the attempt had lasted only a few months before she found herself drawn back, unable to abandon the one person who had ever truly seen her as more than a name and a fortune. "I have made my choice," read one of the final letters in the bundle, Martha's voice growing quieter as she reached it. "Father says if I marry Thaddeus, I will no longer be his daughter. He says I will lose everything, my name, my inheritance, my place in this family forever. I have thought of nothing else for weeks, and I find that I cannot bring myself to regret the choice I am about to make. Whatever I lose, I will gain something far more valuable, a life built on love rather than obligation. I only wish there were a way to keep you close, dear Martha, as I begin this new chapter, but I understand if my father forbids it. Please know that whatever happens, whatever he tells you, I do not regret this. I never will." Martha lowered the letter slowly, her eyes glistening in the candlelight. "That was the last letter she ever sent me," she said quietly. "A few weeks later, I heard she had married Thaddeus in a small ceremony attended by almost no one, and shortly after that, Lord Sinclair informed the household that his daughter had died of fever. I never believed it for a moment. I knew Rosalind too well to think she would simply disappear without a word to me. But I had no way to find her, no way to know where she had gone, and eventually I convinced myself that reaching out might only bring her more trouble than comfort, given how thoroughly her father seemed determined to erase her." Elara sat with the letters in her lap, tears sliding silently down her face, grief and wonder tangled together in a way she had never experienced before. "She never told me any of this," she whispered. "Not once. She let me believe we were simply poor, that we had always been poor, that there was nothing more to our story than hard work and quiet days. She never once complained about what she had given up." "She would not have wanted you to know," Alistair said gently from his seat near the fire. "I suspect she feared that if you knew the truth, some part of you might resent the life she had chosen, might wish for the comfort and privilege she had walked away from. She protected you from that knowledge the same way she protected herself from ever looking back." Elara wiped at her eyes, trying to steady herself, trying to make sense of the enormous shift taking place inside her. "What happens now?" she asked. "If everything you've said is true, if I truly am the heir to my grandfather's estate, what does that actually mean for my life?" Alistair leaned forward slightly, his expression turning thoughtful and serious. "It means a great deal and very little all at once," he said. "Your grandfather passed away 6 years ago, as I mentioned earlier, without any surviving heir he acknowledged. His estate has remained in a kind of legal limbo ever since, managed by trustees, its future uncertain, contested by distant relatives who have spent years attempting to claim it for themselves despite having no direct blood connection to the Sinclair line. If you can prove your identity, and I believe these letters combined with Martha's testimony will go a long way toward doing exactly that. You would inherit everything. The estate, the title that comes with it, the fortune that has sat accumulating interest for 6 years, while the courts argued over who deserved to claim it. Ilara felt dizzy at the scale of what he was describing. I don't know the first thing about running an estate, she said. I don't know anything about titles or courts or managing fortunes. I have spent the last 10 years scrubbing floors and mending torn dresses. I would not even know where to begin. No one expects you to know everything immediately, Alistair said, a small, reassuring smile crossing his face for the first time since they had left the wedding hall. These things are learned, not born into, whatever the old families like to claim about breeding and blood. I will help you if you'll allow it, and I imagine Martha would be willing to advise you as well, given how well she knew your mother and this family's history. Martha nodded firmly. I would be honored, she said. I have waited 12 years to see Rosalind's daughter claim what should have been hers from the beginning. I do not intend to abandon you now, not when we have finally reached this point. Ilara looked down at the bundle of letters in her lap, at the locket resting against her collarbone, at the small gold shape that had connected her, without her ever knowing it, to an entire hidden history. She thought of her mother, young and afraid and determined, choosing love over comfort, choosing a small carpenter's cottage over a grand estate, and never once regretting the choice despite everything it had cost her. I would like to try, Ilara said finally, her voice growing steadier with each word. Not for the fortune, not for the title. I would like to know the truth of where I come from, and I would like to make certain that whatever my mother sacrificed was not sacrificed for nothing. Alistair's expression softened with something that looked almost like admiration. Then we begin tomorrow, he said. My solicitor will need to review everything, the letters, Martha's testimony, and likely commission an investigation into the locket itself to confirm its authenticity beyond any doubt. It will not be a quick process, and I suspect there will be those who resist it, particularly anyone who has benefited from your grandfather's estate remaining unclaimed all these years. You mean Constance, Ilara said quietly. I mean anyone with something to lose, Alistair said carefully. Your stepmother is not the only person who may have taken advantage of your circumstances over the years. We will need to move carefully, and we will need to be prepared for resistance. Outside the small cottage window, the night had grown fully dark, the fire in the hearth burning low, casting long shadows across the room. Ilara sat surrounded by the remnants of a life she had never known existed, holding letters written by a mother she was only now beginning to truly understand. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt something stirring inside her that was not fear or grief or resignation. It was determination. Whatever waited for her beyond the walls of this small cottage, whatever battles lay ahead in courtrooms and legal offices and the careful, calculating world of noble titles and inheritance disputes, she intended to face them with her chin up and her shoulders back, exactly as her mother had taught her, all those years ago, in a cottage not so different from this one. Morning arrived with a knock that came far too early and far too sharp for anyone in Martha's small cottage to mistake it for a friendly visitor. Ilara woke on the narrow guest bed Martha had prepared for her the night before, disoriented for a moment by the unfamiliar ceiling above her, before the events of the previous evening came rushing back in a flood. The wedding, the locket, the Duke, the letters. She sat up quickly, pulling her mother's old dress around her shoulders, and made her way toward the front room just as Martha opened the cottage door. A man stood on the doorstep, dressed in the plain but well-made clothing of someone in service to a wealthy household, and behind him, parked at the edge of the small garden path, sat a carriage far too grand for the modest village lane it occupied. I have come on behalf of the Duke of Ashcombe, the man announced, to escort Miss Sinclair and Mrs. Doyle to meet with His Grace's solicitor at the earliest convenience. Ilara blinked at the name, Miss Sinclair. It was strange to hear it spoken aloud, strange to think of herself as anything other than simply Alara, a name that had never needed a surname attached to it in the Whitmore household, where she had been referred to, more often than not, simply as the girl. The ride to the solicitor's office took most of the morning, winding through countryside that grew increasingly unfamiliar as they traveled farther from the village Alara had known her entire life. By the time the carriage rolled to a stop outside a tall stone building in the heart of the county's largest town, she had spent the entire journey rehearsing, over and over in her mind, everything she would need to say, every question she expected to be asked, every detail of her mother's story she had absorbed the night before from Martha's careful reading. Alistair was already waiting for them inside, along with a thin, sharp-eyed man he introduced as Barnaby Croft, his family's solicitor for nearly 20 years. Mr. Croft greeted Alara with a formal bow that felt strange and unfamiliar, as though he were treating her as someone of importance rather than the servant girl she had been only a day earlier. "Miss Sinclair," he said, gesturing toward a chair across from his desk, "His Grace has explained the situation to me in some detail, though I confess I have rarely encountered a matter quite so unusual in my years of practice. Before we proceed, I must ask you a series of questions, and I must examine both the locket and the letters Mrs. Doyle has provided. I hope you understand that thoroughness is essential here. Given the size of the estate in question, I have no doubt there will be those who challenge any claim you put forward, and we must be prepared to answer every challenge with solid, verifiable evidence." Alara nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "I understand," she said. "Ask whatever you need to ask." The questioning lasted nearly 2 hours. Mr. Croft asked about her childhood, about the cottage where she had lived with her mother, about her father, about the exact circumstances of her mother's death, about every detail she could remember of her early years before Constance Whitmore had taken her in. He examined the locket under a magnifying glass, comparing its engraving carefully against the twin locket Alistair had brought, noting every similarity in a small leather notebook. He read through Martha's collection of letters with careful, methodical attention, occasionally pausing to ask Martha to clarify a date or a detail, cross-referencing everything against records he pulled from a tall cabinet along the far wall of his office. By the time he finally set down his pen, the light outside the office window had shifted from morning to early afternoon, and Alara felt entirely wrung out from the effort of recounting every painful and precious detail of her past to a stranger taking careful notes. "Well," Mr. Croft said finally, folding his hands atop his desk, "I will not pretend this is a simple matter. The Sinclair estate has been the subject of legal dispute for 6 years, ever since Lord Edmund Sinclair's death, and there are at least 3 distant relatives who have submitted competing claims over that time, each hoping to inherit in the absence of a direct heir. None of their claims are particularly strong, built as they are on distant family connections rather than direct lineage, but they have each retained solicitors of their own, and I have no doubt they will fight fiercely against any claim that would eliminate their chances entirely." "What happens next?" Alara asked. "Next," Mr. Croft said, "I formally submit a claim on your behalf to the court overseeing the estate, along with all the supporting evidence we have gathered. The court will schedule a hearing, likely within the next several weeks, during which the other claimants will have the opportunity to challenge your claim directly. I expect they will attempt to discredit the locket, the letters, and Mrs. Doyle's testimony in whatever way they can manage. You should prepare yourself for a difficult process." Alistair, who had remained mostly silent throughout the questioning, spoke up now. "I intend to testify on Miss Sinclair's behalf," he said. "My family's connection to the Sinclair line is a matter of public record, and I am prepared to confirm the authenticity of the locket personally before the court if it becomes necessary." Mr. Croft nodded approvingly. "That will help a great deal, Your Grace. A testimony from a duke carries considerable weight in matters like this, particularly given your family's documented history with the Sinclairs." As the meeting drew to a close, Ilara found herself increasingly aware of a growing unease settling in her stomach, a sense that the path ahead of her, however hopeful it had seemed the night before, was going to be far more difficult than she had first imagined. She thought of Constance, of the desperate fear that had crossed her stepmother's face in the wedding hall, and wondered just how far the woman might go to protect whatever advantage she had gained from Ilara's years of ignorance. Her worry proved well-founded far sooner than she expected. They had barely returned to Martha's cottage that evening, exhausted from the long day of questioning, when another knock sounded at the door, sharper and more urgent than the one that had woken them that morning. Martha answered it cautiously, and Ilara watched from across the room as a young boy, no older than 12, stood on the doorstep, out of breath, clutching a folded piece of paper in his hand. "Message for Miss Sinclair," the boy said between gasping breaths, "from a woman near the market square. She said it was urgent that I should run the whole way here." Ilara took the paper with a growing sense of dread, unfolding it carefully as Martha handed the boy a small coin for his trouble. The handwriting inside was unfamiliar, cramped and hurried, as though written in a great hurry by someone afraid of being seen writing it at all. "Miss Sinclair," the note read, "I have information you need to hear before your claim goes before the court. Your stepmother has visited a man in town twice this week, a man known for making inconvenient problems disappear for the right price. I do not know exactly what she intends, but I believe your safety may be at risk. Meet me tomorrow at the old mill outside the village at noon alone, and I will tell you everything I know. Please come. I fear for what may happen if you do not." Ilara read the note twice, her hands trembling slightly as the words settled over her. She looked up to find Alistair watching her with concern, his earlier composure replaced by something sharper and more alert. "What is it?" he asked. She handed him the note without a word, watching his expression darken as he read it, his jaw tightening with every line. "You cannot go alone," he said immediately, once he had finished reading. "This could easily be a trap, an attempt to lure you somewhere isolated where you would have no protection at all." "But what if it isn't a trap?" Ilara said. "What if someone genuinely knows something important, something that could help protect the claim we're building, or protect me from whatever Constance is planning? I can't simply ignore a warning like this." "Then we go together," Alistair said firmly. "But not alone and not without taking every precaution. I will bring men I trust to keep watch from a distance. If it is a genuine warning, we will hear it. If it is a trap, we will be prepared." Martha, who had been listening to the exchange with growing concern, reached out to take Ilara's hand in her own weathered fingers. "Your mother faced her own share of danger all those years ago, choosing the path she chose," she said quietly. "She survived it because she was careful, and because she had people around her she could trust. You are not facing this alone, my dear. Remember that." Ilara looked down at the note again, at the warning scrawled in hurried, anxious handwriting, and felt the full weight of everything that had changed in the span of a single day settle over her shoulders. Only yesterday she had been nothing more than an unwanted servant in a house that had never valued her. Now she stood at the center of a legal battle over a vast inheritance, facing threats from unknown enemies, protected by a duke who had recognized her mother's locket across a crowded wedding hall. She thought of her mother again, young and determined, choosing to walk away from everything she had known rather than live a life dictated by someone else's fear. "Tomorrow, then," Ilara said, folding the note carefully and tucking it into the pocket of her dress. "But we go prepared for anything." Outside, the evening had settled into full darkness, and somewhere beyond the walls of the small cottage, the wheels of a much larger and more dangerous game had already begun to turn. The old mill stood at the edge of a field gone wild with tall grass, its wooden wheel long since stopped turning, its walls weathered gray by decades of wind and rain. Ilara arrived just before noon, seated beside Alistair in a plain, unmarked carriage he had borrowed specifically for the occasion, one that would not announce his identity or wealth to anyone watching from a distance. "Remember," Alistair said quietly as the carriage rolled to a stop a short distance from the mill, My men are positioned along the tree line. If anything feels wrong, if anything at all seems dangerous, you call out, and they will reach you within moments." Alara nodded, though her heart was pounding hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "I remember," she said. "I'll be careful." She stepped down from the carriage alone, as the note had instructed, and made her way across the overgrown field toward the mill's entrance, the tall grass brushing against her skirts with every step. The building loomed larger as she approached, its door hanging slightly open, creaking softly in the light breeze that moved through the abandoned structure. "Hello," she called out, stopping just inside the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior light. "I received your note. I'm here as you asked." For a long moment, silence answered her, broken only by the soft creak of old wood settling somewhere above. Then, from a shadowed corner near the base of the mill's great wheel, a figure stepped forward, and Alara felt a small jolt of recognition. "Agnes," she breathed, "it was you." The young housemaid who had smuggled her the wedding invitation 3 days earlier stepped fully into the light, her face pale and drawn with worry, glancing nervously toward the doorway as though afraid someone might have followed. "I'm sorry for the secrecy," Agnes said quickly. "I did not know who else to trust, and I was afraid Lady Whitmore might discover I had warned you if I approached more directly." "What do you know?" Alara asked, stepping closer. "The note said my safety might be at risk." Agnes glanced toward the doorway once more before continuing, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "2 nights ago, I overheard Lady Whitmore speaking with a man in the study, late, after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. I was passing in the hallway and stopped when I heard your name mentioned. She was asking him to find a way to discredit the letters, to prove they were forgeries, or to find some way to make Mrs. Doyle's testimony seem unreliable. When he said such things were difficult to arrange convincingly, she offered him a considerable sum of money to ensure it happened anyway, one way or another." Alara felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "Discredit the letters," she repeated slowly. "She wants to prove they're false." "There's more," Agnes continued, her voice growing tighter with anxiety. "I heard her mention Mrs. Doyle by name, saying that if the old woman could be convinced her memory was failing, if enough doubt could be cast on her reliability as a witness, the entire claim might collapse before it ever reached a proper hearing. The man she was speaking with, I did not recognize him, but he had the look of someone accustomed to handling unpleasant business quietly, for the right price." "Did you hear anything about a plan to harm anyone directly?" Alara asked, thinking immediately of Alistair's warning about a trap. Agnes shook her head quickly. "No, nothing like that, I promise you. Lady Whitmore is many things, but I do not believe she would risk something so severe, not with a duke already involved and so many eyes watching. I believe her plan is subtler than that. She intends to attack the evidence itself, to make the court doubt everything before you ever have the chance to properly present your case." Alara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, relief mixing with a fresh wave of anger at the depth of her stepmother's determination to protect whatever she had gained from Alara's years of ignorance. "Thank you for telling me this," she said. "I know it must have been difficult coming here, risking so much to warn me." "I could not stay silent," Agnes said simply. "I have watched you suffer in that house for years, Alara, watched Lady Whitmore treat you as less than nothing while claiming to have cared for you out of kindness. When I smuggled you that invitation, some part of me hoped something like this might happen, though I never imagined it would unfold quite so dramatically. I only wish I had found the courage to help you sooner." Alara reached out and took the younger girl's hands in her own, squeezing them gently. "You've helped me more than you know," she said, "both then and now. Whatever happens with the estate, whatever happens with the court, I will not forget what you've risked to warn me." They spoke for several more minutes, Agnes providing every detail she could remember of the conversation she had overheard, while Alara committed each piece of information carefully to memory, knowing Mr. Croft would need every scrap of it to prepare their defense against whatever Constance intended to attempt. When they finally parted, Agnes slipping away through the tall grass toward the road that would carry her back to the Whitmore household before anyone noticed her absence. Alara made her way back toward the waiting carriage, her mind racing with everything she had just learned. Alistair stepped down to meet her halfway across the field, his expression tightening with concern as he took in the troubled look on her face. "What happened?" he asked. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Alara assured him quickly. "It wasn't a trap. It was Agnes, the housemaid who first gave me the wedding invitation. She overheard Constance planning to discredit the letters and Mrs. Doyle's testimony, hiring someone to help her do it." Alistair's jaw tightened as she relayed the full details of the conversation, his expression growing darker with every word. "This does not surprise me," he said once she had finished. "I suspected your stepmother would not simply accept losing everything without a fight. We will need to inform Mr. Croft immediately, and we will need to take extra precautions to protect both the letters and Mrs. Doyle herself, in case Constance's hired man attempts something more direct than simply casting doubt through legal channels." "Do you think Martha is in danger?" Alara asked, alarm rising sharply in her chest at the thought. "I think we should not take any chances," Alistair said firmly. "I will arrange for additional protection at the cottage, and I will have the original letters moved to a secure location, perhaps my own estate, where they will be far more difficult for anyone to tamper with or steal." As they made their way back toward the carriage, Alara found herself studying Alistair's profile in the afternoon light, struck by how thoroughly he had committed himself to helping her, a young woman he had known for barely a full day, simply because of a locket he recognized across a crowded room. "Why are you doing all of this?" she asked quietly. "You could have simply mentioned the resemblance and let the matter rest there. Instead, you've involved your solicitor, your household staff, your own reputation, all to help someone you met only yesterday." Alistair considered the question for a long moment before answering, his expression thoughtful. "My family failed your mother once," he said finally. "My own mother was Rosalind's cousin, and though she loved Rosalind dearly, she never once tried to intervene when Lord Sinclair cast her out, never once reached out to help her when she vanished from the family entirely. I have always believed that silence, that failure to act when it mattered, was its own kind of betrayal. When I saw that locket last night, I understood immediately that I had been given a chance to correct a mistake my own family made decades ago. I do not intend to let that chance slip away." Alara felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, a feeling she did not entirely have a name for yet, something that mixed gratitude with a growing sense of trust in this man who had upended his own life so readily to help hers. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." "Do not thank me yet," Alistair said, a faint smile crossing his face as he helped her back into the carriage. "We have a difficult road ahead of us still. Your stepmother will not surrender easily, and the court hearing that awaits us will test everything we have gathered. But I believe, with the truth on our side and enough determination to see it through, we will prevail." As the carriage rolled away from the old mill and back toward the village, Alara found herself watching the passing countryside with a strange mixture of fear and hope, aware that whatever peace she had felt over the last day was about to be tested in ways she could not yet fully imagine. The days that followed passed in a blur of preparation, each one bringing new developments that Alara struggled to fully absorb amid the whirlwind her life had become. Alistair arranged for the letters to be moved to his own estate, Ashcombe Hall, under careful guard, and insisted that both Alara and Martha relocate there as well, citing the safety concerns that had grown sharper since Agnes's warning at the old mill. Ashcombe Hall was unlike anything Alara had ever seen. The estate sprawled across acres of carefully tended grounds, its main house rising 3 stories tall, built of pale gray stone that seemed to glow faintly gold in the late afternoon light. Alara had grown up believing grand houses like this existed only in the stories her mother used to tell her at bedtime, and standing before it now, knowing that a house very much like it, the Sinclair estate itself, might soon belong to her, filled her with a dizzying mixture of excitement and disbelief. "You will grow accustomed to it," Alastair told her with a small smile as they climbed the wide stone steps toward the entrance, Martha following slowly behind them with the help of a cane and a gentle-faced servant who had been assigned to assist her. "Though I confess, watching you take it all in reminds me a little of my own childhood, the first time my father brought me here as a boy. It seemed impossibly large then, too." Alara's room, when she was shown to it, was larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in with her mother. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the tall windows overlooking the gardens below, the soft carpets, the carved wooden furniture polished to a warm shine, and felt a familiar wave of guilt rise in her chest, the same guilt that had followed her through every strange, wonderful moment since the wedding. "It feels wrong," she admitted quietly to Martha later that evening, as they sat together in a small sitting room near her new quarters, "to have all of this so suddenly, when I spent so many years with almost nothing at all." "It is not wrong," Martha said gently. "It is simply new and unfamiliar, and your heart has not yet caught up with everything your circumstances have already changed. Give it time. Your mother struggled with something similar, I think, though in the opposite direction, learning to live with less after growing up with so much. You will find your balance just as she did." The following morning brought word from Mr. Croft that the court had scheduled a preliminary hearing for the following week, giving them barely enough time to finalize their preparations before facing the challenge of presenting Alara's claim before a panel of judges who would ultimately decide whether the evidence they had gathered was sufficient to grant her the inheritance. It was during this period of frantic preparation that the first real attack came. Alara had been in the estate's library one afternoon, reviewing the letters alongside Mr. Croft as he prepared his formal arguments for the hearing, when a servant burst into the room without knocking, her face pale with alarm. "Your Grace," the servant said, addressing Alastair directly, her voice trembling slightly, "there is a disturbance at the gate. A man is demanding entry, claiming he has evidence proving the letters are forgeries. He says he was hired originally to create false documents on behalf of Lady Whitmore, but that his conscience will not allow him to remain silent any longer." Alastair rose immediately, his expression sharpening with alert concern. "Bring him to the front hall," he said, "but have 2 of the household guards present at all times. I do not trust anyone connected to this business without careful verification first." The man who was eventually shown into the front hall was younger than Alara expected, perhaps in his 30s, dressed in plain traveling clothes, his hands twisting nervously in front of him as he took in the grandeur of the estate around him. He introduced himself as Nathaniel Prout, and explained, in a halting voice, that he had indeed been approached by an agent of Lady Whitmore's several weeks earlier, offered a considerable sum to produce forged documents that would cast doubt on the authenticity of any letters or records connecting Alara to the Sinclair family. "I nearly did it," Nathaniel admitted, his eyes fixed on the floor rather than meeting anyone's gaze directly. "I have a family to feed, and the money offered was more than I could refuse under ordinary circumstances. But when I began the work, when I actually sat down to forge documents meant to deny a young woman her rightful inheritance, I found I could not bring myself to finish it. My own daughter is close to your age, Miss Sinclair. I kept thinking of her, wondering how I would feel if someone tried to cheat her out of what was rightfully hers." Mr. Croft, who had been listening intently throughout Nathaniel's account, leaned forward with sharpened interest. "You still have the documents you were commissioned to forge?" he asked. "And any correspondence connecting Lady Whitmore to the arrangement?" Nathaniel nodded, withdrawing a small leather satchel from beneath his coat and setting it carefully on the table before them. "Everything is here," he said. "The unfinished forgeries, along with 2 letters from the agent who approached me on Lady Whitmore's behalf, detailing exactly what was requested and how much I was to be paid. I understand this puts me at risk as well, admitting to my involvement, however incomplete. But I would rather face whatever consequences come from honesty than live with the knowledge that I helped cheat someone out of their rightful place in this world. Alara stepped forward, moved deeply by the man's confession, and by the courage it must have taken to walk through the gates of a duke's estate and admit to his own near involvement in a scheme against her. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know this could not have been an easy decision." "It was not," Nathaniel admitted, "but it was the right one. I only hope it helps rather than complicates your case before the court." It helped considerably. Over the following days, Mr. Croft worked carefully through the evidence Nathaniel had provided, cross-referencing the correspondence with records of payments withdrawn from accounts connected to the Whitmore household, building a case that went far beyond simply proving Alara's identity as Rosalind Sinclair's daughter. It now included clear evidence that Constance had actively conspired to deny Alara her rightful inheritance through deception and forgery, a revelation that Mr. Croft assured them would weigh heavily in their favor before the court. News of Nathaniel's confession seemed to spread quickly through the county, whispered from household to household in the particular way that scandal always seems to travel faster than any official announcement. Alara learned, through a brief note delivered by one of Alastair's household staff, that Verity had left her new husband's home only days after the wedding, returning to her mother's house amid rumors that the marriage itself had already begun to crumble under the weight of the scandal surrounding her family. It was Verity herself who appeared at the gates of Ashcombe Hall a few days later, unannounced, her fine wedding clothes replaced by a simple traveling dress, her face pale and drawn in a way Alara had never seen before. "I did not come to cause trouble," Verity said quickly, when Alara agreed to meet with her in one of the estate's smaller sitting rooms, choosing to keep the conversation brief and formal rather than allowing her stepsister into the more private areas of the house. "I came because I need to tell you something, and I did not know who else I could trust to hear it honestly." Alara studied her stepsister carefully, searching for any sign of the cruelty she had grown accustomed to over the years, and found instead something that looked almost like genuine remorse. "I'm listening," she said cautiously. "I did not know the full truth," Verity said, her voice trembling slightly. "Not everything my mother knew, not the details about your family's history or the inheritance, but I knew enough. I knew there was something about your past she was hiding, something she did not want either of us to fully understand. I never asked questions, because asking questions in our household never led anywhere good, and because, if I am honest with myself, some part of me benefited from your circumstances remaining exactly as they were. I am not proud of that. I have had a great deal of time to think, these last few days, about the kind of person I have allowed myself to become, watching you scrub floors and mend torn dresses while I wore silk, and never once questioned why the arrangement seemed so unfair." Alara said nothing for a long moment, allowing the weight of her stepsister's confession to settle between them. "Why are you telling me this now?" she finally asked. "Because my marriage has already fallen apart, because my mother's reputation is already in ruins, and because I have very little left to lose by finally telling the truth," Verity said, a bitter edge creeping into her voice. "Edmund left me within days of the wedding, once the scandal became public knowledge. He said he could not build a life with a family capable of such deception, and I find, much to my own surprise, that I cannot entirely blame him for the decision." "I'm sorry," Alara said, and found that she meant it despite everything. "Don't be," Verity said, shaking her head. "I do not deserve your sympathy, not after everything I allowed to happen under our roof. I came here today because I wanted you to know that I am prepared to testify honestly before the court, if it comes to that, about everything I witnessed growing up in our household. I cannot undo the years you spent suffering, but I can at least make certain the truth is fully known, whatever consequences that brings for my mother and for myself." Alara studied her stepsister's face for a long moment, searching for any hint of manipulation or deceit, and found only weary honesty staring back at her. "Thank you," she said finally. "I believe you mean that." "I do," Verity said quietly. I only wish I had found this kind of honesty sooner, when it might have actually changed something for you, rather than only after everything had already fallen apart. As Verity departed later that afternoon, disappearing down the long drive that led away from Ashcombe Hall, Elara stood at one of the tall windows overlooking the grounds and felt, for the first time since the whole strange ordeal had begun, a small measure of genuine hope that whatever awaited her at the court hearing, the truth itself had grown too large and too well documented for Constance Whitmore to bury it any longer. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a gray sky and a fine, cold mist hanging over the county courthouse, as though the weather itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold within its walls. Elara stood outside the tall stone building, dressed not in her mother's old torn dress, but in a simple, well-made gown Alistair had insisted on providing for the occasion, dark blue and modest, chosen specifically to reflect dignity rather than extravagance. "Are you ready?" Alistair asked quietly beside her, watching her carefully for any sign of the nerves he clearly suspected were building beneath her composed exterior. "No," Elara admitted honestly, "but I don't think I'll ever feel entirely ready for something like this. I suppose I simply have to walk in anyway." Inside, the courtroom was already filling with spectators by the time they took their seats, word of the scandal having spread widely enough through the county that curiosity alone had drawn a considerable crowd eager to witness the proceedings firsthand. Elara spotted Constance seated near the front of the room, dressed in severe black, her face composed into careful neutrality, though Elara could see the tension in the way her hands gripped the edge of the bench beneath her. Beside Constance sat a solicitor Elara did not recognize, an older man with a stern, unreadable expression, and behind them, in the rows reserved for the other claimants contesting the Sinclair estate, sat three separate parties, distant relatives who had spent years pursuing an inheritance they had never expected to actually receive, now watching the proceedings with obvious anxiety over what Elara's claim might mean for their own chances. The presiding judge, a heavy-set man with silver hair and an expression that gave away nothing of his own opinions, called the proceedings to order shortly after the hour, and the hearing began. Mr. Croft presented Elara's case first, methodically laying out the evidence they had gathered over the preceding weeks. He introduced the letters, reading select passages aloud to the court, and called Martha to the stand to testify about her long relationship with Rosalind Sinclair and the circumstances of her disappearance from the family home more than 2 decades earlier. Martha's testimony was steady and clear despite her age, her voice carrying easily through the quiet courtroom as she recounted, in careful detail, everything she remembered of Rosalind's final months at Ashcombe before her departure, and the letters that had followed in the years after. "And you are certain," the judge asked, leaning forward slightly in his seat, "that the woman you describe and the child seated before this court today are indeed mother and daughter?" "I am certain," Martha said firmly. "I recognized Rosalind's handwriting the moment I read the letters aloud again these past weeks, and I recognize her spirit in her daughter's face, and in the courage it took for her to stand here today, before this entire court, and demand the truth be heard." Alistair testified next, confirming the authenticity of the locket through detailed knowledge of the Sinclair family's traditions, describing the jeweler who had crafted both lockets generations earlier, and explaining his own family's documented connection to Rosalind through his mother's cousinship. He spoke with the calm, unshakable authority of a man accustomed to being believed, and Elara watched several members of the court's audience nodding along with his testimony, clearly persuaded by the weight of his standing and the clarity of his account. Then Nathaniel Prout was called to the stand, and the courtroom fell into a hush of anticipation as he described, once again, the commission he had received to forge documents undermining Elara's claim, and the payments he had traced back to accounts connected directly to the Whitmore household. It was during this testimony that Constance's solicitor rose sharply to object, his voice cutting through the courtroom with practiced indignation. "Your Honor, This man's testimony amounts to nothing more than an unsubstantiated confession, offered by someone who could easily have fabricated the entire account in exchange for a portion of the estate should the claim succeed. I ask that his testimony be struck from the record entirely." The judge considered the objection for a long moment before responding. "The testimony will remain on record," he said finally, "though the court will weigh its credibility appropriately alongside the physical evidence Mr. Prout has provided, including correspondence and financial records that corroborate his account independently." Constance's solicitor sat back down, his expression tight with barely concealed frustration, and Alara felt a small flicker of hope building in her chest as she watched the evidence continue to mount steadily in her favor. When it came time for Constance's own defense, her solicitor rose to present a case built primarily around casting doubt on the reliability of Martha's memory, suggesting that an elderly woman's recollection of events more than 2 decades old could not be trusted with the certainty the court required, and further suggesting that the locket itself, while genuine in its craftsmanship, might have come into Alara's possession through means entirely unconnected to any direct blood relationship with the Sinclair family. "It is entirely possible," Constance's solicitor argued, "that the locket was given to Miss Sinclair's mother by a member of the Sinclair household as a gift, or acquired through some other means entirely unrelated to direct lineage. Without more concrete proof, a birth record, a marriage certificate, something beyond letters and an old woman's fading memory, this court cannot in good conscience grant such a significant inheritance based on circumstantial evidence alone." It was a reasonable argument, delivered with practiced skill, and Alara felt her earlier hope wavering slightly as she watched several members of the judging panel exchange thoughtful glances with one another. Then Mr. Croft rose once more, a small, satisfied expression crossing his face as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, in anticipation of exactly this line of argument, I took the liberty of commissioning a thorough investigation into parish records from the village where Rosalind Sinclair and Thaddeus Hale were married. I am pleased to present, for the court's consideration, the original marriage record itself, recovered from the parish archive, listing both parties by their full legal names, along with a birth record for Alara Sinclair Hale, registered in the same parish some years later, listing Rosalind Sinclair as the child's mother." A murmur moved through the courtroom as Mr. Croft presented the documents to the judge, who examined them carefully, his expression shifting subtly as he reviewed the official seals and signatures that marked them as authentic parish records. Constance's face, Alara noticed, had gone entirely pale. "These documents," the judge said finally, looking up from the papers in his hands, "appear to be entirely genuine, bearing the official seal of the parish in question. Combined with the testimony already presented and the physical evidence of the locket itself, I find the evidence supporting Miss Sinclair's identity to be substantial and compelling." Constance's solicitor attempted one final argument, shifting his strategy toward questioning whether, even if Alara's identity as Rosalind Sinclair's daughter could be established, the estate itself might rightfully pass to one of the other claimants, given the length of time that had passed since Lord Sinclair's death and the absence of any formal claim filed by Alara during that period. The judge considered this argument more seriously than the others, taking a long pause before responding. "It is true," he said, "that considerable time has passed since Lord Sinclair's death without a claim being formally filed. However, the evidence presented today makes clear that Miss Sinclair was entirely unaware of her connection to the Sinclair family until very recently, having been raised in circumstances that deliberately obscured this knowledge from her. I do not find it reasonable to penalize her for a delay caused by circumstances entirely outside her control or knowledge." He turned his attention toward Constance directly for the first time since the hearing had begun, his expression growing sterner. "Furthermore," he continued, "the evidence presented today, particularly regarding the attempted forgery scheme connected to your household, raises serious questions about your own conduct in this matter, Lady Whitmore. This court will be referring that evidence to the appropriate authorities for further investigation, separate from these proceedings." Constance said nothing, her face a mask of barely controlled panic, as the judge turned back toward the full courtroom to deliver his final ruling. "Based on the evidence presented today," the judge announced, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "this court finds that Alara Sinclair Hale is indeed the legitimate granddaughter of the late Lord Edmund Sinclair, and as such, the rightful heir to the Sinclair estate, its titles, and its accompanying fortune. The competing claims presented by other parties are hereby dismissed as lacking sufficient evidence of direct lineage. This court further directs that the transfer of the estate be finalized within 30 days, pending final administrative review." The courtroom erupted into a wave of murmured reactions, some approving, some clearly disappointed among the ranks of the dismissed claimants, but Alara heard almost none of it, too stunned by the weight of what had just been announced to fully process the noise around her. She had won. She turned toward Alistair, who was already watching her with a warm, proud smile, and beside him Martha, tears of relief and joy sliding freely down her weathered cheeks. Alara felt her own eyes filling with tears as the reality of everything that had happened over the past several weeks finally settled fully into place. She was no longer simply Alara, the unwanted servant girl from the Whitmore household. She was Alara Sinclair Hale, heir to an estate and a legacy her mother had sacrificed everything to walk away from, now returned to her at last, not through inheritance alone, but through the courage it had taken to demand the truth be heard, whatever the cost. Across the courtroom, Constance Whitmore sat frozen in her seat, her carefully constructed world finally, completely collapsed, while somewhere nearby, unseen but felt deeply in Alara's heart, she imagined her mother watching, proud at last of the daughter who had refused to let her sacrifice be forgotten. The weeks that followed the court's ruling brought changes so rapid and so profound that Alara sometimes found herself standing quietly in a room of her new estate, simply trying to remember how to breathe normally amid the constant whirlwind of her transformed life. The formal transfer of the Sinclair estate took place exactly as the judge had directed, and Alara found herself, barely a month after standing in a wedding hall dressed in a torn blue dress, walking through the halls of Ashcombe Estate not as a guest but as its rightful mistress, the weight of the title Lady Sinclair settling over her shoulders in a way that felt both entirely surreal and, in some quiet corner of her heart, deeply right. The investigation into Constance's conduct moved forward alongside the estate transfer, and within weeks, formal charges of fraud and attempted forgery had been filed against her, built on the evidence Nathaniel Prout and Agnes had provided, combined with financial records that traced the payments Constance had authorized in her failed attempt to discredit Alara's claim. The proceedings that followed stripped away what remained of the Whitmore family's standing in the county, and Alara learned, through occasional updates from Mr. Croft, that Constance had ultimately been sentenced to several years of confinement, her once considerable social standing reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered among the very circles she had once moved through with such practiced grace. Alara took no particular satisfaction in her stepmother's downfall. She had spent enough years under Constance's control to understand, with painful clarity, exactly how much suffering the woman's choices had caused, but she found, when the final verdict was delivered, that her strongest feeling was not triumph but simple, quiet relief that the truth had finally been allowed to stand on its own, unburied at last. Verity's path proved more complicated. Her marriage to Edmund Ashford dissolved entirely in the aftermath of the scandal, and with her mother's reputation and fortune both destroyed, Verity found herself facing a future considerably more uncertain than the one she had expected on her wedding day. To Alara's genuine surprise, her stepsister did not disappear entirely from her life in the months that followed. Instead, Verity wrote to her occasionally, brief, careful letters expressing continued remorse for the years of cruelty Alara had endured under their shared roof, and slowly, cautiously, A strange new understanding began to grow between them, not quite friendship, but something gentler than the bitterness that had defined their relationship for so many years. "I do not expect you to forgive everything," Verity wrote in one such letter, several months after the hearing had concluded. "I do not think I could forgive it myself were our positions reversed. But I wanted you to know that I think of those years often, and I regret, more deeply than I can properly express, the person I allowed myself to become within them. If there is ever a way I might make amends, however small, I hope you will let me know." Alara considered the letter carefully before responding, weighing years of accumulated hurt against the genuine remorse she sensed in her stepsister's words. In the end, she wrote back a short reply, offering neither full forgiveness nor continued resentment, but something more measured, an acknowledgement that people could, sometimes, grow beyond the choices of their past, if they were willing to do the difficult work required. Learning to manage, the Sinclair estate proved to be its own considerable challenge, one that occupied most of Alara's waking hours in the months following the court's ruling. She had inherited not only a grand house and a substantial fortune, but also the responsibility of dozens of tenant families who depended on the estate's management for their livelihoods, along with a complex web of financial obligations, agricultural decisions, and social expectations she had never been prepared for during her years scrubbing floors in the Whitmore household. Martha, who had chosen to remain at Ashcombe as Alara's companion and advisor rather than return to her small village cottage, proved invaluable during this period, drawing on her own decades of experience working within noble households to help Alara understand the countless unwritten rules and expectations that governed her new position. Alastair, too, remained a constant and steady presence, visiting frequently to offer guidance on matters of estate management, patiently answering the endless stream of questions Alara found herself accumulating with each new challenge she encountered. "You are learning faster than most people born into this position ever manage," Alastair told her one afternoon, several months into her tenure as Lady Sinclair, as they walked together through the estate's extensive gardens, discussing a recent dispute among tenant farmers that Alara had successfully mediated only days earlier. "I confess, I did not expect anyone to adapt to this life so quickly, having spent their entire childhood in circumstances so entirely different." "I had good teachers," Alara said, glancing sideways at him with a small smile. "Though I suspect some of what I've learned came simply from spending 10 years watching how not to treat the people who depend on you. Constance taught me, without ever meaning to, exactly the kind of mistress I did not want to become." Their relationship, which had begun in the chaos of that first strange encounter at Verity's wedding, had continued to deepen steadily throughout the months that followed, growing from cautious gratitude into something Alara found herself increasingly unable to deny. A warmth and comfort in Alastair's company that went far beyond simple appreciation for the help he had provided during her legal battle. It was Alastair himself who finally acknowledged what had been growing between them, on an evening in early autumn, as the two of them sat together on the wide stone terrace overlooking Ashcombe's gardens, watching the sun sink slowly toward the horizon in a wash of deep orange and gold. "I have spent a great deal of time these past months," he said quietly, "telling myself that my continued involvement in your life was simply a matter of correcting an old family debt, of ensuring justice was properly served for what happened to your mother all those years ago. I find, increasingly, that this explanation no longer feels entirely honest, even to myself." Alara turned to look at him, her heart beginning to quicken slightly at the careful, deliberate way he had chosen his words. "What would you say instead?" she asked softly. Alastair held her gaze steadily, something warm and earnest replacing the careful composure he usually maintained. "I would say that I find myself thinking of you far more often than any matter of family debt or justice requires," he said. "I would say that watching you grow into this new role, watching your courage and your kindness reshape everything around you, has become one of the great privileges of my life these past months. And I would say, if you'll permit me the honesty, that I have come to care for you far more deeply than I ever anticipated when I first recognized that locket across a crowded wedding hall." Elara felt her breath catch slightly, the warmth of his words settling over her like the last golden light of the setting sun. She thought of everything they had endured together over the past several months, the courtroom battles, the careful investigations, the countless quiet conversations that had gradually built a foundation of trust and understanding between them, and found that his words matched something she had been feeling herself, something she had not yet found the courage to name aloud. "I have come to care for you as well," she admitted quietly. "More than I expected to, given how strangely everything began between us. I find myself grateful, every single day, that you noticed a small gold locket at a wedding you might just as easily have ignored entirely." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun continued its slow descent, and Elara found herself thinking, not for the first time, of her mother's letters, of the courage it had taken Rosalind to choose love over the comfortable, expected path laid out before her. She understood now, in a way she had not fully appreciated when Martha first read those letters aloud, exactly what her mother had meant by the particular joy of being truly seen by someone, valued not for a title or a fortune, but for exactly who she was underneath it all. In the months that followed, their relationship continued to grow, steady and unhurried, built on a foundation far sturdier than the sudden drama of their initial meeting. Elara found herself, more and more often, imagining a future that included Alistair not simply as a trusted advisor and friend, but as a permanent presence in the life she was slowly, carefully building for herself. Word of her transformation, from unwanted servant to rightful heir of the Sinclair estate, had spread throughout the county in the months since the court's ruling, and Elara found herself increasingly recognized in social circles she had never previously been permitted to enter. She navigated these new experiences with the same careful determination that had carried her through every challenge since that fateful evening at Verity's wedding, learning gradually to trust her own instincts, to speak with the quiet confidence her mother had once taught her, chin up, shoulders back, and never let them see you shrink. She had not forgotten where she came from, and she had no intention of ever letting that memory fade entirely. She made certain, in the months following her inheritance, that every servant working within her household was treated with the dignity and respect she herself had so rarely received during her years in the Whitmore house. She established a small fund, drawn from her considerable new fortune, to support young women in circumstances similar to those she had once endured, offering them education and opportunity that might otherwise have remained entirely beyond their reach. Agnes, the young housemaid whose courage had first set the entire chain of events into motion by smuggling Elara that fateful wedding invitation, was among the first to benefit from this new fund, and Elara watched with quiet pride as the girl who had once risked so much on her behalf began her own education, preparing for a future far brighter than anything she might have imagined while still working within the Whitmore household. As autumn deepened into winter, and the first snow began to settle over Ashcombe's grounds, Elara found herself standing once again at the tall windows of her new home, watching the pale flakes drift slowly past the glass, and thinking of everything that had changed since that terrible, wonderful evening when a stranger's eyes had landed on a small gold locket and recognized, in an instant, the daughter of a woman he had spent 22 years searching for. She thought of her mother, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she was finally living the kind of life Rosalind Sinclair had always hoped her daughter might someday claim, not simply a life of wealth and title, but a life built on truth, on courage, and on the quiet, unshakable certainty of knowing exactly who she was. Winter had nearly given way to the first tentative signs of spring when the final challenge to Elara's inheritance arrived, delivered not through legal channels this time, but through a quiet, almost apologetic letter from one of the distant relatives whose claim had been dismissed during the original court proceedings. The letter came from a man named Peregrine Sinclair, a second cousin twice removed who had pursued the estate for nearly 2 years before Alara's claim rendered his own efforts irrelevant. Mr. Croft delivered the letter personally to Ashcombe Hall, his expression carefully neutral as he handed it to Alara across the study desk, where she now conducted much of the estate's business. "He has filed a final appeal," Mr. Croft explained, "arguing that new information regarding your father's family background may complicate the legitimacy of your claim. I do not believe the appeal holds significant merit, but the court has agreed to hear it, given the size of the estate involved." Alara felt a familiar flicker of anxiety rise in her chest as she read through the letter's careful, formal language, though the feeling was considerably less overwhelming than it had been during the original hearing months earlier. She had grown, in the time since claiming her inheritance, considerably more confident in both her own standing and in the strength of the evidence that had originally secured her claim. "What kind of new information could possibly matter at this point?" she asked, setting the letter down and looking toward Mr. Croft with a steady, measured expression that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known her during her years in the Whitmore household. "He claims to have discovered records suggesting your father, Thaddeus Hale, may have had an earlier marriage that was never formally dissolved before his union with your mother," Mr. Croft explained. "If true, this could theoretically raise questions about the legitimacy of your parents' marriage, and by extension, your own legal standing as heir." Alara felt a brief flash of worry at the suggestion, though it faded quickly as she considered the claim more carefully. "Do you believe there is any truth to it?" "I have already begun investigating," Mr. Croft said. "Preliminary records suggest the claim is almost certainly false, likely fabricated in a final, desperate attempt to reopen the estate for contention. I expect to have conclusive evidence disproving the allegation within a matter of weeks, but I wanted you to be aware of the challenge before it reaches the court formally." True to his word, Mr. Croft returned less than 3 weeks later with definitive proof that the alleged earlier marriage had never existed, built from careful investigation into parish records across 3 separate counties, thoroughly demonstrating that Thaddeus Hale had never been married to anyone before Rosalind Sinclair. The appeal was formally dismissed shortly afterward, and Peregrine Sinclair, facing the possibility of legal consequences for filing what the court determined to be a knowingly false claim, quietly withdrew from any further pursuit of the estate entirely. Alara received the news of the appeal's dismissal with a quiet, settled relief, rather than the anxious tension that had characterized the original court battle. She had learned, over the preceding months, to trust in the strength of the truth she had fought so hard to uncover, and to face each new challenge with the steady confidence her mother had once taught her, rather than the fear that had governed so much of her earlier life. It was only a few weeks after the final appeal's dismissal that Alistair asked her to walk with him through Ashcombe's gardens one evening, just as the last light of day was beginning to soften into the gentle purple of early dusk. Alara had grown accustomed, over the months of their deepening relationship, to these quiet evening walks, treasured moments of calm amid the ongoing responsibilities of managing her considerable new estate, but something in Alistair's demeanor that evening felt different, more deliberate, carrying a quiet nervousness she had rarely seen him display. They stopped near a small stone bench overlooking a garden pond, its surface reflecting the deepening colors of the evening sky, and Alistair turned to face her with an expression that mixed warmth with unmistakable nervousness. "I have thought carefully about how to say this," he began, "and I find that I have rehearsed a dozen different speeches in my mind these past weeks, none of which feel entirely adequate to what I actually want to express." Alara felt her heart quicken, some part of her already anticipating what was coming, though she remained still and quiet, allowing him the space to find his own words. "From the moment I recognized that locket at Verity's wedding," Alistair continued, "my life has been irrevocably changed by your presence in it. I have watched you face impossible challenges with a courage I have rarely encountered in anyone, watched you rebuild an entire life from nothing, and watched you extend grace and kindness to those who have wronged you, even when such grace was not required of you. I find that I do not wish to imagine a future that does not include you at the center of it." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a ring set with a single, elegant stone that caught the last light of the setting sun. "Alara Sinclair Hale," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly building beneath it, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Alara felt tears gathering in her eyes, joy so complete it nearly overwhelmed her entirely, as she looked from the ring to the man kneeling before her, a man who had changed the entire course of her life simply by noticing something precious hidden beneath rags that everyone else had chosen to overlook. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, of course, yes." Their wedding took place in early summer, held in the very same grand hall where they had first met nearly a year earlier, though this time transformed entirely from the scene of scandal and revelation into a celebration of everything that had grown from that strange, fateful evening. Alara stood at the front of the hall, dressed not in a torn blue dress but in a gown of pale silver silk, the small gold locket that had started everything resting proudly, visibly, at her throat rather than hidden beneath her collar as it had been that first night. Martha sat in the front row, tears of joy sliding freely down her weathered cheeks, having lived long enough to see Rosalind's daughter not only reclaim her rightful place in the world but find happiness beyond anything the old woman had dared hope for her. Agnes, now well into her studies thanks to the fund Alara had established, sat nearby, dressed in a fine gown of her own, watching the ceremony with an expression of pure, unguarded joy. Even Verity attended, seated quietly toward the back of the hall, having spent the preceding months slowly rebuilding a modest but honest life for herself, working as a seamstress in a small shop several towns over, having chosen, in the aftermath of her family's downfall, to build something entirely her own rather than depend on the connections and privileges she had lost. When the ceremony concluded, she approached Alara briefly, offering a small, genuine smile. "Your mother would be proud of you," Verity said quietly. "I only wish I had understood, all those years ago, exactly how much courage it must have taken to survive everything you endured, and how much strength it took to become the person standing here today." "Thank you for coming," Alara said simply, and found that she meant it entirely, the last remnants of old bitterness finally, fully dissolved into something closer to peace. As the wedding celebration continued into the evening, filled with music and laughter, and the warm glow of countless candles lighting the same grand hall where everything had first begun, Alara found herself stepping briefly onto a quiet terrace outside, needing a moment alone to absorb the full weight of everything her life had become. She touched the locket at her throat gently, thinking of her mother, of the courage it had taken Rosalind to walk away from everything she had known in pursuit of a life built on love rather than obligation, and understood now, more completely than ever before, exactly why her mother had never once expressed regret for the choice she had made. Alara had spent 10 years believing herself unwanted, invisible, worth nothing more than the labor she could provide to a household that had never valued her. She had arrived at Verity's wedding in a torn blue dress, expecting nothing more than a brief glimpse of a life she had been excluded from, and had instead discovered an entire hidden history, a family she never knew existed, and a love she had never dared imagine for herself. She thought of the small gold locket, worn smooth with age, passed down through generations of Sinclair daughters, and understood now that its true value had never been in the gold itself, or even in the noble bloodline it represented, but in the simple, unbreakable thread of love it had carried across 22 years and 2 generations, connecting a mother who had sacrificed everything for love to a daughter who had, in turn, found her own way back to exactly the kind of life her mother had always hoped she might someday claim. Behind her, the sound of music and celebration continued to drift out from the grand hall, and somewhere among the crowd, she knew Alistair was likely searching for her, eager to continue the celebration of the life they were building together. But for this quiet moment, standing alone beneath the gathering stars, Alara allowed herself simply to breathe, to feel the full weight of everything she had overcome, and to whisper a quiet word of gratitude to the mother whose courage had, against every possible expectation, led her daughter home at last. She turned back toward the warm light of the hall, toward the music and the laughter and the man waiting to spend his life beside her, and walked forward into the future her mother had always believed, somewhere deep in her heart, that her daughter might someday claim for herself. Chin up, shoulders back, and never ever let them see you shrink. The end.